Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Palace Confidential. And it's been a year of extraordinarily anticipated royal books, but none more so than the one written by my guest today. During his time as royal correspondent for The Times, Valentine Low has broken a number of royal stories, including that the palace was investigating claims of bullying made by staff against the Duchess of Sussex. His new book, called Courtiers, The Hidden Power Behind the Crown, looks at the fascinating position occupied by those who work for the royal family and how they shape what goes on. Valentine is with me now. Welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me on.
We have so much to discuss, including your behind-the-scenes account of Megxit, among other things. But before we get into it, just tell us, where did the idea for the book come from?
It came from Meghan's interview with Oprah Winfrey, when she spoke about...
Oh, so something good came of that.
Exactly. When she spoke about the institution, she contrasted the institution with the family, and basically was having a dig at the people who worked there, the men in grey suits, as Diana used to call them, and implying that really a lot of what went wrong in her time in the royal family was down to the people who worked behind the scenes, the palace advisors, the men in grey suits. And the idea came up, well, let's have a look at them. Who are they? What do they do? And are they as bad as they seem?
And do you think that it was that interview with Oprah that meant that a lot of people you spoke to felt aggrieved enough to speak up and get their side across?
I think they felt that it was a valid exercise to explain what they did, because no one's ever had a serious look at who these people are and what they do. And it's very easy to caricature them as the men in grey suits, a sort of untrustworthy, Machiavellian, scheming bunch. And actually, a lot of them are very public-spirited and trying to do a decent job.
And who are they? What kind of people are they? You know, from your book and from descriptions from various members of the royal family, they seem to sort of like be part staff, part friend, part relative. How do they get that balance right in those jobs?
It's very difficult, because you're doing a job that's both professional and personal. And the thing of being it's very interesting, just to go back in history a bit, there was someone called Lord Stamfordon who worked for the royal family for ages and ended up being George V's private secretary, and he died still in post in his 80s. And when he died, George V said that his loss is irreparable. And Queen Mary said that George was like a child who'd lost a dear nanny.
Oh,
it was extraordinary. That was the sort of closeness of the relationship. But they do have to be professional. But they can become almost like a friend. And one very interesting example of that was someone called Jamie Lowther Pinkerton, who was William and Harry's first private secretary. And he would always have said that while working for them, he was not a friend, he was an advisor, he was a professional. And all the courtiers I spoke to, all absolutely adamant they're not friends. But by the time Jamie finished working for them, he had become a friend of William's. He was, his son was a page boy at their wedding. Jamie is godfather to Prince George, and there's no doubt that Jamie, and I think partly this is a function of him having been there when William and Harry were relatively young, so in a way he kind of, young adults, he saw them kind of growing into their roles as as members of the royal family. And yeah, he became a friend.
It sounds to me like it must be one of the most all-consuming, blurred lines duties. Do you think that you mentioned that this very close friend Jamie left? Is there just an inevitable shelf life in these jobs where you just can't stand it anymore?
I think there can be a shelf life. It can be very difficult, and we're seeing that right now with Sir Edward Young, who worked for the Buckingham Palace for a long time, worked for the Queen, ended up as the Queen's private secretary. He's now staying on but only for a few months, because Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, worked with him when he was Prince of Wales. He's going to be the #1 guy, and basically Sir Edward is going to do the handover. So that's an example of it being a short shelf life. But some of them stay there for years, and in fact Sir Clive has been there for a long time. He had a stint as Prince Charles's foreign affairs advisor, essentially, became deputy private secretary, then went off to become ambassador to Morocco, and then came back as his principal private secretary. He's one of the longest serving private secretaries for Charles.
Wow.
And I think he will be there for the duration.
Now, you said that Diana used to sort of like eye-rollingly refer to men in grey suits, but there doesn't seem to be an enormous amount of women. Is that fair?
It is absolutely fair.
Why is that?
There are women, but I'll notice Prince Charles, now the King, has never had a woman private secretary, principal private secretary, ever. He's had about 10, I think. Prince William, who has done what he can to kind of modernise how he runs the household and has really tried to make it a bit more inclusive. He has never had a woman as principal private secretary. So, and don't get me started on the lack of ethnic minorities.
Yes, well, that's another interesting thing, isn't it?
It's a pretty pale male stale environment.
But do you think, is there, I'm being cheeky with this, but is it just that King Charles can't bear the idea of yelling at a woman? He's like, he's much more likely to feel comfortable losing his temper.
Well, he does yell a bit. In the description of someone I spoke to, he goes from 0 to 60 in a flash.
Well, we've seen, haven't we?
Yeah, we've seen with the pens.
Yeah.
But I think he recovers quite quickly, and I don't think it's necessarily aimed at people personally. It's aimed at situations, but he does get frustrated. Does he not like to shout at a woman? I'm not so sure about that. There was someone called Sally Osman who was his communications secretary for a while, and he welcomed her. She was the new thing, and then within a week, he lost his temper, and later he said to someone else, he was very worried that he might have put Sally off already after only a week.
Well,
So
you may as well know what you're getting in for. But what do you think? Do you think the courtiers have, in their ways, shaped the kind of king that Charles will be?
I think partly they've shaped the kind of king he'll be, but also they've reflected it. I mean, it's very interesting. The different courtiers, the different sort of private secretaries he's had at different times of life have kind of reflected who Charles was. So there was a time when he was very much about setting up his charities. He was the prince with a social conscience, and the successful advisors from that era were those who were very much in tune with that, and the unsuccessful ones, and there were unsuccessful ones, were the ones who didn't really kind of believe in Charles's mission in the way he did. But later, Charles moved on to different things, and he wanted to cast himself more as a kind of global statesman, and it was the job of the people around him to help shape that and reflect that and advance that.
What about Charles's younger life? Do you see parallels with some of the frustrations that you talk about with Charles when he was making his way as a young prince and sort of like looking at shaping his future as the king? Is there any parallel with that and his son Harry?
Yeah, I think that there are parallels. Charles was faced when young with a long period of being the heir to the throne, and he wanted to do more than some previous Prince of Wales's have done, which they basically had a nice time.
Yeah, I don't know why you wouldn't do that, but anyway.
He wanted to do some good, and it's fantastic. And he had this idea of helping disadvantaged youth, and that eventually became the Prince's Trust, which is a phenomenally successful charity and has helped more than 1 million young people, and it's brilliant. I mean, the list of people he's helped is long. But there were some people within Buckingham Palace who were not helpful at that time, and I think Charles got frustrated, and in different ways. Harry has been frustrated, and Harry has had a similar drive to Charles in the sense that Harry is aware that he has, or he felt that he had a limited shelf life.
I found that fascinating because he could absolutely have an amazing legacy with things like the Invictus Games. Why does that have to come with a shelf life?
I know, but he felt that royals become, if they're not on the track to become monarch, they become less relevant as they grow older, as they move down the line of succession, and as younger, more glamorous, more interesting roles come along. After all, Duke of Kent, who these days kind of even knows who the Duke of Kent was, but he was once something like, I don't know, 8th in line to the throne. But so Harry felt that by the time Prince George was going to be 18 or so, no one would care about Harry. So he had this relatively small number of years in which he could make an impact, and he was very keen to make an impact quickly, which is why the Invictus Games, he did it fantastically swiftly. From having the idea to it being realised was just 1 year. I mean, it was breakneck speed.
That's incredible. But it does seem, in fairness, like there is a certain amount of culture of no matter how powerful you are, you could be the king, the queen, the Prince of Wales, but there is this whole system that you come up against within the walls of those palaces.
Yeah, there is a system, but there's another way of looking at it, that you're there as part of an institution. And the Queen was always very firm that the long-term security and stability of the institution was what mattered above any sort of personal needs or desires.
Well, let's move. That brings us nicely on to Prince Andrew.
God bless him.
Car crash interviews, bad choices. Do you think if he'd had better courtiers, things would have been different?
He had a very good advisor in some respects, in the form of a woman called Amanda Thirsk, who was very sharp, very dedicated, incredibly hardworking.
But is this the woman who organised the Newsnight interview?
Yes, yeah. As well. So she did a lot of good for Andrew. I mean, she helped him when he was setting up his pitch at Palace thing, which, you know, at a time when his reputation was not terrific, it gave him some kind of validation. But she had a blind spot about the media. She didn't really understand the media. And when Epstein kind of revived itself, and the accusations surfaced again, because the accusations had been around for some number of years, and then when he was arrested for the second time and when he died, they resurfaced. And interesting, there was no new accusation against Andrew. The evidence against him and what Virginia Giuffre was saying hadn't changed. There's nothing new there, but somehow the pressure was renewed and it wasn't going away. And she thought, well, maybe we just have to do an interview. But the problem was that Andrew had form. A couple of years or so earlier, he'd given an interview to the Sunday Times, and it was an absolute car crash. It was a disaster. He came across as a fool, who wasn't master of his brief, couldn't answer the most basic questions, even questions which he should have been prepared for. And therefore, in the light of that, the Newsnight interview was really a dodgy thing to do. And even if you decided you had to do it, you should have prepared him within an inch of his life.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you should have prepared him to, make sure you say something to express sympathy about the women who've been victims of Epstein. And also you should have removed all those incredibly foolish remarks about sweating and Pizza Express in Woking. I mean, daft stuff which anyone with any public relations nous would have realised would play extremely badly. But they didn't have the media experience, and they weren't listening to sufficient outside voices to be warned.
It's fascinating, isn't it? But Andrew, you talk about also work with Charles to try to get rid of another big name, Sir Christopher Gite. Is it fair to say that often the courtiers are simply victims of family feuds and end up as collateral in that with their careers?
I don't think it happens very often. I mean, and Christopher Gite Christopher Gite used to be very close to Charles. I mean, they used to have private meetings in the summer up in Scotland where they'd discuss big issues in the long term. And Christopher Gite was an incredibly clever chap, still is a incredibly clever chap, and Charles admired his intellect. But there was a time when Christopher wanted to merge the sort of palace communications empires, and to cut a long story short, Charles thought it was a bad idea and thought he was trying to nick or defang his own press office, and Charles basically became rather suspicious and less enamoured of Christopher after that. And then later, after the death of Philip, Christopher Gite made a speech which was interpreted within Charles's household as a bit of a takeover grab, telling the rest of the royal family what to do.
Wow.
And Christopher ended up being ousted, essentially because he'd crossed Charles and his household.
The mental gymnastics that go on. But
yeah.
Do they ever, the courtiers, do they ever get to tell off the royals? I understand Fergie's had a dressing down.
Yeah, Fergie did have a dressing down, but Fergie was on the way out by then.
So it was safe.
She was already separated from Andrew, so I think
Yeah.
they felt quite confident about that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, William seems to come out of your book as someone who has a healthy relationship with his staff. He loves informality, and he's very cautious about things like background checks for donors and things, which would be well advised in other quarters, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the informality. It's very interesting the levels of formality and informality. You know, in Charles's household when he was Prince of Wales, it was the first thing in the morning it was Your Royal Highness, and so after that, and last thing at night was Your Royal Highness. And William, there was none of that. With his closest advisors, it would definitely be first name terms. But they were cautious to call him Prince William and Sir when they were in company. And there was a fascinating kind of detail, which I kind of love, was in the very early days, again when they were sort of young adults, he had a tiny team around them. William had a very, very small team, and it was very informal. They'd sort of share pizzas with their advisors. But the advisors would always get up when they came in the room. And William and Harry would always say, no, please don't get up. And the next time they come into the room, they'd all get up because they believed that they should get you. This is how you're going to be treated as a member of the royal family. People are going to get up when you come in the room. And so these advisors thought, we've got to get them used to this. We've got to get them used to being a member of the royal family.
Wow.
And eventually, after a while, William and Harry just stopped saying, please don't get up. They just gave up. They lost that battle.
Oh my God. One story that has long been discussed is Tiaragate. And you provide some clarity on this one.
Yes, I mean, from what I understand, the original version of that story which surfaced suggested there was a row about which tiara Meghan would have for her wedding. And I don't think that's the case. That's wrong. I mean, she was given by the Queen a choice of tiaras. She chose one. It's the one she wore at the wedding, and that was all absolutely fine. Where the problem came was a short while later, was that she wanted to have a fitting. So it was for her hair, because as you can imagine, wearing a tiara and having your hair done for your wedding, they're closely entwined.
We've all been there, Valentine. We've all been there, yeah.
Anyway, Meghan's hairdresser was in town. I think he was based in Paris. He was in town, and therefore she wanted a fitting. And the problem was that Angela Kelly, who was the Queen's dresser and a lot more beside, who basically had the keys, controlled access to the tiara, she wasn't around. And Meghan and Harry were demanding that we have the fitting today. And Angela Kelly said, sorry, I'm not available. And that caused a certain amount of dissent in the ranks, shall we say.
Oh dear. Well, you actually do paint quite a detailed picture of the entrance and eventual exit of Meghan and Harry, and the problems seemed to start very early there, didn't they?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the problems started before the wedding. I mean, there were a lot of rows before the wedding about all sorts of things, not just the tiara, about the choir, about the food, and there was a problem when the kind of the drip of news stories before the wedding. You'd always have a drip of news stories. The palace would put out little details about the cake, about the dress, about the whatever, to keep the media happy. And somehow Meghan thought we ought to change that because it wasn't suiting her for some reason. And they had to rip up plans, and some poor woman was presented an alternative plan. And Meghan was really unhappy with this alternative plan and said to this woman, listen, if there's anybody else I can get to do this, believe me, I would.
That is my favourite quote from the book. It's just such a devastating thing to say to somebody.
Such a crushing thing to say in front of other people.
It's just extraordinary. And now Samantha Cohen's another one who has worked with the Sussexes. She was very popular. She was a very popular member of the Queen's staff before she moved to work for them. What was her experience of that?
I think Sam, who, as you say, was very popular, very highly regarded, and got on well. You know, Harry knew her well. When she started, Harry knew her well and liked her, and she liked Harry. And Sam is a great problem solver. She's incredibly sort of can-do personality, and she just found it really difficult. I think she was asked to do things which a private secretary wouldn't normally be asked to do, and I think she was treated harshly. I think she was shouted at by Meghan and possibly Harry, I don't know. And you know, she's got broad shoulders, Sam, but I think she found it very difficult. She was said to have said that dealing with them was like dealing with a couple of teenagers.
Yeah, it's fascinating. That's the thing, and I think sometimes in our press it becomes all about Meghan's diva-ish behaviour, but Harry was capable of angry emails and strops as well.
Yeah, I mean, Harry, who has a long track record of not trusting the courtiers from the other household, from Buckingham Palace or from Clarence House, he really had it in for Sir Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, and Sir Clive Alston, Charles's private secretary, and from the accounts I've been told, used to send them incredibly rude emails.
Now, a lot of you say that the staff called Meghan a narcissistic sociopath. I mean, that's quite strong.
It is strong, and they'd also say we were played. They, you know.
How so?
They felt that she always had an agenda to get out.
Really? From even before.
Even before.
It was, we knew about it. Yeah.
And they had been devoted. They had really tried hard to make it work. But they had a rough time, and they felt treated badly.
How do you feel about the Sussexes having done all this research?
I think it's quite complex, because I think there was never what they wanted, and what the royal family, really, the Queen, felt able to provide. There was never going to be any common meeting ground. There's no compromise. So in a sense, I think it was inevitable that they should leave. But the tragedy was it was so acrimonious. It didn't have to be so acrimonious. Now, I think the institution and the people who work for them tried hard to show flexibility, to have a different way of working. There was one courtier, senior courtier called Miguel Head, who had a meeting with Meghan before the wedding and said, listen, we can, there's no fixed way of you fulfilling this role. We can talk.
Let's craft it.
Let's craft it.
Yeah.
So they were going out of their way, and someone else, David Manning, former ambassador to Washington, who's their foreign affairs advisor, he cooked up this plan that suggested they spend some time living in South Africa. Didn't work in the end, but it was the point is it was a big effort to try and show flexibility, to try imaginative ways of working. But where the institution went wrong is that in about the first year or so of their marriage, and in particular between January 2019 and about late summer, early autumn of that year, that was the period when Meghan and Harry, in particular Meghan, was deeply unhappy. And they were obviously frustrated. And no one really kind of flagged it up. No one had a big meeting in which they sat down and said, listen, this is going wrong. Let's talk about this. Let's work out how we can solve it.
Yeah.
And they didn't do that until it was too late. And I think that was a failure on their part. So, yeah, Harry and Meghan could be difficult. I mean, I don't think there's any denying that. But I don't think the palace rose to the occasion either.
What do you think that the people you spoke to wanted to achieve out of speaking to you about all of this, if anything?
I think what they wanted to achieve is say, listen, there's another story here. Meghan has done a very good job of portraying herself as a victim of this cold, unfeeling institution, and they're saying, actually, it's more complicated than that.
Have you heard from any of the Sussexes' legal team?
Not yet, but I
Not
think
yet. That's rather ominous. Yeah.
They know my email address.
Watch this space. And you quote one insider who believes that ultimately Meghan did Harry the greatest kindness. What is that? Yeah,
I mean, I think that's possibly the most significant quote in the whole book. And what this person who knows Harry, who doesn't really approve of what Harry and Meghan did, but they said to me, in a way, she did him the greatest kindness, because they knew that for the last couple of years of his working life, Harry was really unhappy, but they didn't know what to do about it. And then Meghan came along and showed him a way out. And in that way, possibly she did them the greatest kindness. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
It's fascinating. Well, the reminder that Valentine Low's excellent book is called Courtiers, The Hidden Power Behind the Crown, and it's out now, published in the UK by Headline. You can click the link below if you want to buy it. That's all we have time for on this special episode of Palace Confidential, but join us again for more royal news and views next Thursday. See you then. Bye-bye.